Right, should dietary fat guidelines have been introduced? I'm going to try to do in the next half an hour what I've never done before, and that is to cover my PhD in 30 minutes. Don't worry, it's still going to be entertaining. It's not going to be as funny as yesterday, I have to promise you. If any of you are fans of Shakespeare, I think yesterday was the comedy and today is the tragedy. And that's the last joke, trust me. Okay, declarations. I write and publish books and web content. I do not endorse anything. I do not receive income from any third party. I'm completely independent. I can write and speak as I find. And it was very amusing. Dr. Malcolm Kendrick said, "What's this new declaring books thing?" He said, "Surely if I write in a book as I find, and I write in an academic paper as I find, that's a consistency of interest, not a conflict of interest." But there you go. I thought that was quite funny. Here's what we're going to cover in the next half an hour. The dietary fat guidelines, what were they, when did they come in, why did they come in? And then there's the 4 parts to the PhD. First of all, did the randomised controlled trial evidence support the dietary fat guidelines at the time? Did the epidemiological evidence? Then bring it up to date. Do the RCTs today support the guidelines? Does the epidemiological evidence today support the guidelines? And then to look at other reviews of the evidence and to conclude. Now at the bottom there, you can see that all the references in this presentation are on my site /PhD-thesis/references. So if you like a particular one, you want to see the reference, look at the number on the bottom left hand of the slide and it's all on there. So when, you know this, 1977 dietary goals for the United States, they then get embedded in the dietary guidelines for Americans that come out in 1980 and of course then get revised every 5 years thereafter. Britain followed the US, as did then every other nation, developed nation certainly in the world. So in 1983, we adopted pretty much the same guidelines. They were embedded in a 1984 diet and cardiovascular disease paper. And essentially we did a U-turn in our dietary advice from, and I always credit Gary Tobes for this quote, it's from Good Calories, Bad Calories, what a find, from Tanner 1869, which was the Bible, the practice of medicine, until we started messing around with dietary guidelines. And the quote was, farinaceous, floury, and vegetable, interesting. Foods are fattening, and saccharine, sugary matters, especially so. And we changed to base your meals on starchy foods, those very foods that we knew caused a problem. And this is from the 1984 COMA report, which I've just referenced. So they actually acknowledged the previous advice where we thought we needed to limit carbohydrates as a matter of weight control. We're now turning that on its head, and we think the problem now is to limit our diet to 30% total calories in the form of fat and 10% of our total calories in the form of saturated fat. This is really important. We do not tell people to eat carbohydrates because we know them to be healthy. We have not even tested it. It is the inevitable consequence of setting the dietary fat guideline because there are only 3 things that we eat. Protein is in everything other than oils and sucrose. So in a real food diet, plant or animal, protein tends to stay fairly constant at around 15% of the diet. So limit fat to 30, you've immediately set a dietary guideline of 55% carbohydrate. And indeed, that figure is in the 1977 report from the US. In fact, they say 55 to 60% of your diet in the form of carbohydrate. Now, why did we do this? And I hope you like these numbers as much as I do, because I hear in the UK, 1 in 3 people are dying from heart disease. And I wonder why at the end of the year I haven't had to delete 1/3 of the numbers in my mobile phone. Because this is how you play with numbers. Okay, we'll have a bit of humour then. 1950, this was the death rate from all causes. Approximately 1,400 people per 100,000. Of those, 589 died from heart disease. So actual deaths from heart disease, when all of this, let's demonise fat, sort out heart disease, when all of this was happening, actual deaths from heart disease was 0.589%. And that wouldn't trouble me too much. So you can look at heart deaths as either 0.589, which is the right number, or of the people who die, 40% are dying from heart disease. And that was in the opening volume of the 7-country study published in 1970, where Keyes said, as a matter of urgency, 4 in 10 middle-aged men are dying from heart disease. We have to do something about this. Now, there's some great references down on the left-hand side there. I spent about a year of my PhD looking at the review of the literature, and those are all the references for particularly the Russian pathologists looking at the rabbit studies at the beginning of the last century. They were the ones who noticed when they were doing autopsies of people who had died suddenly, they were finding fatty lipid deposits around the scene of the damage in the arteries. And of course, the argument for those who don't think that cholesterol is a problem is that cholesterol is there to fix the damage. It no more caused the damage than the firefighters who arrived to fix the fire set the fire. So there were some great studies. They noticed, they made this association between cholesterol in the blood and sudden death from heart disease. And that's Ansel Keys on the right. And Ansel Keys became very, very interested in this. As Michael Eads shared this morning, he'd done the brilliant Minnesota starvation experiment. He was the man of the moment. He turned his attention to heart disease. Now, this is one of my favourite quotes of Keyes that I have ever found, because he spent the early 1950s trying to show, did cholesterol in food cause cholesterol in the blood to rise? And to do that, they didn't have ethics in those days, so he just took human guinea pigs, fed them inordinate amounts of dietary cholesterol, and he concluded, this was presented at a symposium on atherosclerosis in 1954, the evidence, both from experiment and field surveys, indicates that cholesterol in itself, in all the natural diets, has no significant effect on either the blood cholesterol level or the development of atherosclerosis in man. Now, you will probably be aware that the only foods that contain cholesterol are animal foods: meat, fish, eggs, and dairy. And he knew that. Another publication, cholesterol only occurs in foods of animal origin. So to do those experiments, he had to feed his human guinea pigs copious quantities of animal foods. And he concluded that that did not raise blood cholesterol and it did not cause atherosclerosis. So he's exonerated animal foods. And yet he didn't realise that. If cholesterol has no effect, then foods of animal origin have no effect. He should have turned his attention to the one macronutrient that is not found in meat, fish, and eggs, and is only found in small amounts in dairy, and that is, of course, carbohydrate. But he didn't. He could not get over the idea that fat was the enemy. So, the RCT evidence at the time, this was when my little research world changed. A paper was published in February 2015, and The Guardian picked it up as the fat guidelines lacked scientific evidence, which was an accurate portrayal of the paper. For those of you who know the Daily Mail, this was an inaccurate representation of the paper because the paper didn't mention butter. Butter might be good for you, but that's not what the paper said. The Telegraph got it right, saying that the guidelines should not really have been introduced. The Express got it even more wrong than the Daily Mail. It was picked up by Time magazine and the Sydney Morning Herald and the New Zealand Herald, and that was the paper. And it went down like a lead balloon in the UK, I can tell you. And Public Health England were seriously not happy. But very interestingly, they didn't challenge the fundamental finding of the paper, which was that the evidence from randomised control trials was not there at the time the guidelines were introduced. And to show you how interesting this topic is to people around the world, that paper was the 64th most impactful paper in any discipline, from climate change to child psychology to nutrition, in 2015. But that's when the authorities start kicking back. So what I did in that first part of the PhD was to say, we've got a modern technique of systematic review and meta-analysis. What if the Dietary Guidelines Committee had had that tool at the time and they were going to honestly appraise the evidence? So the best available evidence, the pyramid of the quality of evidence, would be a meta-analysis of randomised controlled trials. So those are the 6 trials, only 6 trials that would have been available to them. And you guys will be familiar with those, the Sydney Heart Study, Rose Corn Oil, and so on. I've put all the data on that slide so that you can refer back to it. And that's the summary of the people involved, whether or not they were secondary, primary studies, sick people, healthy people. That's the meta-analysis. That's the forest pot, also called blobogram, which I quite like. And if you can see that bottom blob, it is absolutely firmly on the line of no effect. That's for all-cause mortality and the dietary interventions from each of those 6 RCTs. That's for coronary heart disease deaths. Absolutely sat firmly on the line of no effect. So the conclusions from that paper, remember the dietary fat guidelines, 30% total fat, 10% saturated fat. No RCT had actually even tested either of those 2 guidelines. Well, actually Woodhill, tested 10% saturated fat, but the deaths were significantly higher in the intervention than they were in the control. So that was the only one that got close to either of those. I've put the numbers in there for you. They're just the numbers from the forest plot for those of you to refer back to. It's just the confirmation of the risk ratio straddling the line of no effect. This was another really interesting finding. So mean blood cholesterol levels fell over the duration of the studies in both the intervention groups and the control groups. They fell more in the intervention groups, but it made no difference to either all-cause mortality or coronary heart disease mortality. Now, I have a theory as to why that is the case. And one of the references on the bottom left is another paper that I did with my supervisor where we looked at plant sterols, because a lot of the interventions were vegetable oils which contain plant sterols. Plant sterols, of course, compete in the gut with human cholesterol and replace it in effect. Now, I don't know about you, but I think my body's probably making the cholesterol that it needs and didn't, if it wanted plant cholesterol, it would probably have gone out and got some from the supermarket or something. So that's probably not a good idea. And sure enough, we showed in that paper that plant sterols do lower cholesterol. That's how margarines work, but they increase the risk of heart disease. So that is why I think we had that cholesterol finding. But that in itself, that one paper, if you want to show somebody, does lowering cholesterol impact mortality or heart disease mortality, that's the paper to go to. This was one that really hit the media, actually. The recommendations were made for 276 million people. That was the population of the UK and the US who were impacted by this at the time, following studies of fewer than 2,500 sick men, middle-aged sick men. We have a term in meta-analysis where we say, are the results generalizable? Can they be applied to whole populations? Absolutely not. No study actually recommended change. You would think the committee would have gone back to the studies and said, did they recommend change? No. The research committee, the final sentence is, a low-fat diet has no place in the treatment of myocardial infarction, heart attack. Rose, with the corn oil study, cautioned this is not beneficial and may indeed be harmful. And Woodhill was also concerned about the possible toxicity of the vegetable oil. So no study recommended change. So the bottom line, we can unequivocally say the RCT evidence did not support the dietary guidelines. Now you could actually stop there. But to be robust, let's look at the epidemiological evidence, because that has been relied upon. Whether it should have been or not, it has been. This was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. You've got the table there again. Again, you'll be familiar with the studies from Framingham, the 7-country study, Honolulu, Western Electric study. You've got the men involved, and it was men again. You've got the number of years of duration of the study, whether or not they tested cholesterol, and only a couple did, and then the significant findings. Now, not many people know this. The 7-country study, not even the 7-country study by Ansel Keys, who from about 1953 had been continually demonising total fat, he concluded in the 7-country study that there was no relationship with total fat and coronary heart disease. Now, what he did find was that there was an association, a relationship between saturated fat and coronary heart disease. But if you look down that second from last column, he was the only one to find that. So you've got 6 saying no relationship with total fat, 1 saying that there's a relationship with saturated fat. Look at the other findings, because a couple of them, as we would expect, found an association with smoking. For any of you in the audience who like drinking, you will particularly like Framingham and Honolulu, because they found an inverse association with the more alcohol that you drank, the lower the risk from heart disease. Now, the obvious confounder there, before you rush out to the grocery store, is obviously income, because more affluent people might be more likely to drink and more likely to be able to afford better healthcare, less likely to die from coronary coronary heart disease. So a bit of a confounder there. But the 7-country study said that there's no association with smoking, there's no association with exercise, and there's no association with weight. So we gave a huge weight to this 7-country study when we knew it to be wrong on a number of factors, when it just said alone that there's something with saturated fat. So let's have a quick look at this 7-country study. Those are the 7 countries, nearly 13,000 men. Those are the verbatim conclusions from the 20th volume of the 7-country study 1970. And those are the words used. So it wasn't a strident assertion, saturated fat will kill you. It's coronary heart disease tends to be related to cholesterol. And cholesterol tends to be related to saturated fat. And if A tends to be related to B and B tends to be related to C, then A, B and C are all related to each other. And that's as far as he went in the 7-country study. 25 years later, Menotti published a paper along with Keyes saying, if we now look back at it, looking at the cholesterol level at the start of the study, the entry to the study, just knowing that, we can predict with a Pearson correlation coefficient of 0.72 who would be dead from coronary heart disease over the 25-year period. So the R was 0.72, R squared, which tells you effectively the strength of the relationship, 0.52. So I looked at that data and I recreated it so I could see exactly what Keyes had done to know that I was about to use the same methodology. And I noticed a much stronger correlation. And that much stronger correlation was with coronary heart disease deaths and the latitude of both the country and the cohort. There was virtually no difference. And the R was 0.96. That's for the country. For the cohort, it was 0.93. The R squared is then 0.92. That is a serious, valid explanation of a relationship. Well, does it make sense? Yes, it does. Because what it's saying is that the countries and cohorts further away from the equator, the populations have more cholesterol because it hasn't been turned into vitamin D. And maybe they're dying more from heart disease because they've got lower vitamin D, and the cholesterol is just a marker. And similarly with those close to the equator, they've turned their cholesterol into vitamin D, so the vitamin D might be heart protective. But it's a much better relationship than the cholesterol. And of course, John Yudkin found a great relationship with television sets and car licenses, and he started having a bit of fun with this, but they didn't get on, so he was probably having a bit of a pop there. So the summary of the epidemiological evidence. We again have 6 studies, again only involving men. This time at least we have a few more people. One had both sick people and mostly healthy people, which was the 7-country study, and the rest were healthy people. They were primary studies, which added a new dimension on top of the RCTs. None examined the dietary guidelines, but then you wouldn't expect them to, because that's what an RCT intervention would do. The all-cause mortality across all of those studies was 4.84%. The coronary heart disease mortality was 1.14%. And this is the really interesting one, because in the one study that had healthy people as well as sick people, the 7-country study, the death rate for those who entered the study with previous existing heart disease ended up being 21%, versus a 1% death rate for those who entered the study without heart disease. So what the 7-country study actually showed was that the biggest cause of heart disease is heart disease. And I know it sounds daft, but it's an important point to prove, because you've got to try and avoid that first heart attack, because once you have it, you're in big trouble. But of course, that wasn't declared the major finding. None found any relationship with total fat, 1 found it with saturated fat, and because it's an inter-country study, all the other 5 were actually studies of the same populations. So in the inter-country study, what Keyes wants you to believe is that the death rate in Japan versus the death rate in the US in the 1950s was entirely due to saturated fat. Nothing to do with GDP or climate or community or politics or anything else. It's down to the saturated fat, which is why an inter-country study is the lowest form of epidemiological study. So the epidemiological evidence also did not support the introduction of the dietary fat guidelines. So let's be fair, because the round that started with Public Health England after the production of the first paper was, okay, the evidence may not have been there at the time. I didn't even think they would concede that, but they did rapidly. But the evidence is there now. So let's take a look. That's the paper that looks at the evidence now. You carry forward the original 6 studies, and there are 4 more that need to be considered that look at all-cause mortality and coronary heart disease mortality. And that's the diet and reinfarction trial study, the Minnesota coronary study, which Nina mentioned yesterday, the St. Thomas's atherosclerosis study, and the Women's Health Initiative. There's the forest plot for the full 10. Again, sat firmly on the line of no effect for all-cause mortality. And there's the forest plot for coronary heart disease deaths, firmly sat on the line of no effect. So this time we have 10 RCTs. We've increased the number of participants from 2,500 to 62,000. We've now got women involved. We've still got 8 with men only, 1 with women, and one with women only and mixed. 7 secondary studies, 1 primary study and 2 combined. But only 1 was both primary of healthy people and involving both genders, and that was the Minnesota coronary study. So there's actually only 1 study that you might even consider as generalizable, and then remember that it was done in mental institutions, and you can question whether that is then generalizable to whole populations. We know that, for example, certain medicine for mental illness has an impact on heart disease. None examined the dietary guidelines. France and Woodhill tested the 10% saturated fat. DART tested the 30% total fat. And STARS, we got the closest to testing the 2, 27% total fat, 8 to 10% saturated fat. But it was a tiny study of about 55 people. And when you subject it alone to statistical analysis, it doesn't hold up well. There's your all-cause mortality, just to give you the numbers from the blobograms, and same for coronary heart disease mortality. And again, we had the finding that we had in the first paper, that mean cholesterol levels fell in all cases except 1 exception with the DART control, and they fell by more in the intervention, and that probably could be to do with the plant sterols and the vegetable oils. So the RCT evidence today does not support the introduction of dietary fat guidelines. Sorry, Public Health England, but the evidence just is not there. The final nail in the coffin, or is it? Epidemiological evidence available now. These studies are less familiar to us, I think. So you've got things like the health professionals, the lipid research study, one from Japan, the Zoë Harcombe study. There again, you've got the data, the number of people involved, and the outcomes. So you've got a real mixed bag here. If you look in those 2 final columns, so we're looking at total fat and saturated fat, and you've got some findings for saturated and association. Remember, this is epidemiology, so it's only association, it's not causation. You've got some findings and then some against. You've got an inverse relationship from the Finnish cancer study with saturated fat, but then you've got a couple who find a positive association with saturated fat. A couple of the studies lower down looked differentially at genders, differentially at ages, and found quite different results across genders and ages. But what you then have to do is subject any association to the Bradford Hill test. And only one of those, which is actually the Ashiro finding for saturated fat, gets anywhere close to even the first test under Bradford Hill, which is the strength of association, which needs to be at about 2. Anything at 1.22 relative risk or whatever, anything until you get to 2 is not likely to suggest causation. So we then put those onto the forest plot, and you can see that they're sat on the line of no effect for coronary heart disease mortality and total fat, and here's coronary heart disease mortality and saturated fat. So 7 prospective cohort studies, 89,000 participants, 94% male, all but 1 excluded previous heart disease, and that one actually couldn't be used in meta-analysis. So for the meta-analysis, they were all of healthy people. None examined the dietary guidelines, but then you wouldn't expect them to. There's your risk ratios for coronary heart disease deaths and total fat, then coronary heart disease deaths and saturated fat. And the guidelines do not support, or the epidemiological evidence does not support the current guidelines. Now, why would you trust me? When I started doing this, I had been a vegetarian for 20 years. So I probably went in with a confirmation bias against total fat, against saturated fat, and probably with an idea that saturated fat was almost equivalent to animal fat, which is why I did that postcard, because of course all foods that contain fat contain all three fats, saturated, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. There are no exceptions. So animal fat is not saturated any more than plant fat is unsaturated. And that card, look at it, enjoy it, have some fun with it. But let's see the other people who looked at all-cause mortality and coronary heart disease mortality. So we start off with Skiaf and Miller, 2009. I won't go into all the detail because what I want to take you through is how many other people found no significant difference. So I wanted to put them all together. So they have two findings, both non-significant. Siri Torino, we're all so familiar with this 2010 paper, 350,000 people, 23 studies, no difference, no difference. The first one that did show something significant, I'm going to come back to the ones that come up in red. That's the Mozaffarian study. Then you've got the first of the Cochrane studies. I'm not sure what's happened to the table here, actually. Hopefully it's going to go okay. But you've got the first of the Hooper-Cochrane studies. And you've got 12 analyses there from the Hooper team in 2011, one finding in red. Then you've got Chowdhury, 2014, one finding in red. Schwinkelschak and Hoffman, 2014, no significant findings. Harcombe, I've only put one of ours in there just to be fair. So I haven't put all of our studies on there. No significant difference from either of ours. And then you go up to Hooper in 2015. Now, I was really pleased with this, actually, because Hooper had done what was supposed to be the definitive study saying that there is actually no evidence against total fat. That was in 2011. It didn't then lead all the public bodies to go and change their guidelines on total fat. They just kind of went quiet on it, but they kept wanting to find against saturated fat. So they thought that 2011 study was the final answer. So in the opening to the 2015 Hooper paper, they actually acknowledge our February paper. So what they're saying is we need to counter this bit of nonsense that came out in February 2015 because it's more recent than the 2011. So I was quite chuffed they had to do a bit more work because of our little team up in the University of West of Scotland. So that's their one significant result. So 39 studies or 39 meta-analyses results, risk ratios, and 35 of them were non-significant. So when you look at the 4 that were significant, Mozaffarian, naughty boy, included a study that he shouldn't have done, which was the Finnish mental hospital study, which is not randomised and not controlled, and nobody else includes it. He didn't include the Cornwall study, and he didn't include the Woodhill study. And those are the 2 that act most in the favour of those who are trying to defend saturated fat. So there's a paper reference there where Uffe Ravenscoff led the rebuttal to that paper, and I was delighted to be involved in it. I think, Nikolai, yeah, you were on as well, actually, so we were really proud to be able to kick that one into touch and say it had been a bit naughty. So I think we should ignore that one. Chowdhury, their one finding was against trans fat. Completely agree. No debate there. So we're into Hooper. And this is the final little visit down the rabbit hole, because this is the one that we have to chase down to see, is there any evidence left against saturated fat? So let's look at Hooper. So from 2011 and 2015, the words were incredibly similar, where they say we found our findings are suggestive of a small but potentially important reduction in cardiovascular risk, not mortality, if there's a modification of dietary fat. And then in 2015, they were a little bit more specific, if there's a reduction in saturated fat intake, and if you swap in, for goodness sake, inflammatory polyunsaturated vegetable oils, and if you replace it with carbohydrate, even we, Hooper, will admit that's probably not such a great idea. So those were the 2 things that we had to look into further. And please remember, 11 out of 12 non-significant results. Now, if I'd have been writing that Cochrane paper, I would have had that in the abstract. I would have said the most interesting thing about this is that there are 11 non-significant results. And similarly in 2015, that there is only 1 in 8 significant result. And there's nothing significant, and I think it bears actually saying it out, for all-cause mortality, CVD mortality, coronary heart disease mortality, myocardial infarctions, non-fatal myocardial infarctions, strokes, coronary heart disease events. No findings whatsoever. The one thing that they did find, of course, was that for that cardiovascular disease events. So then you look at how did they even get that one finding for events and saturated fat. And you find that in the 2015, take the most recent paper, of 11 studies which were used to make that conclusion that you should replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats, only one of those studies had actually done that, which was the Dayton LA Veterans Study. And that didn't conclude that that is the kind of thing that you should do. So you then ask the question, why did Hooper find something that all the rest of us didn't? And Hooper actually used 4 studies that nobody else did. And she'd approached other authors of different papers to see if they happened to have cardiovascular disease event information, despite the fact that they'd done other studies. So those are the 4 studies. They've been looking at diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, glucose intolerance, and skin cancer, of all things. The 4 studies only added 646 people to the mix. And when I wrote to Hooper and said, you know, where did you get the data for these? Where's the sort of papers that I can look at? It's pretty much unpublished data, because she had gone directly to the authors. Now, unpublished is also not peer-reviewed. And I looked at the Houtsmuller paper, and it just didn't make sense, because I think it said something like, you know, carbs are 50% and protein is 20% and saturated fat is 30%. It's like, well, no, total fat might fill the rest, but there is no single product in the whole planet that is 100% saturated fat. So there's something wrong there. So that's the reason that Hooper found anything that the rest of us didn't. And then credit to Dr. Trudy Deakin from the UK for this one. She spotted, going through the Hooper paper, and it's about 200 pages long, that because only one of the studies, going up to that second bullet point above, because only one of the studies actually looked at saturated fat reduction and replaced my polyunsaturated fat, the studies are so different. For those of you who know meta-analysis, the I-squared was 65%, which is telling us that the studies are really different. The heterogeneity is really high. So when you have that, you do a sensitivity analysis. And in a table on about page 122 or something, Hooper does the sensitivity analysis that they're supposed to do, and it finds that when you do it, the significance falls away. There is then no statistically significant result whatsoever against saturated fat from all the work that has been done up until this point. And even if there had been, final nail in the coffin, not one study was done on healthy people of both genders. So even if they had found something, those results were not generalizable. So that is it, public health guideline people. That is what you take to them to say, leave saturated fat alone. You've been bullying it for long enough. There's no flipping evidence against this poor little bunny rabbit, so let it go free. That's the complete review of the evidence. I've put on, I think it's missed off the bottom actually, there's the references that I gave you at the beginning. If you remember my website, phd-thesis/references, we've put a PDF at the bottom, which is basically a summary of those 4 nails. So you've got the type, was it systematic review and meta-analysis, or just meta-analysis, sorry, just systematic review, number of studies, healthy people, not healthy people, genders. You've got the summary there that you can carry around to beat anyone up with that you so choose. And we're now on to the conclusion. And have there been any consequences as a result of our demonisation of fat and our concomitant increase in intake of carbohydrate? And Mark Hegsted, who Nina mentioned yesterday, has been instrumental in setting those dietary fat guidelines. One of the quotations from the dietary guidelines reports was from Hegsted saying there will undoubtedly be many people who say we have not proven our point. A number of senators expressed concern and said, look, it's quite clear that the nutritional scientists are not all in agreement. And there's a great YouTube clip that Tom Norton put in his Fathead movie, where one of the scientists, Robert Olson, is saying to Senator McGovern, you know, I pleaded with you in my report, I'm pleading with you here verbally now. We don't have the evidence to launch this experiment on the American population without knowing the consequences. And Senator McGovern, who of course had just been on a Pritikin low-fat boot camp, so he brought his own confirmation bias to the table, he said, it's all right for you scientists. You've got years to look at this stuff. I'm a politician, I've got to deliver an outcome, and I'm going to go ahead and deliver the outcome. So there was a lot of dissent at the time, but it was basically railroaded. And in the narrative of the second edition of the 1977 report, they actually noted the concerns that people had. Some witnesses have claimed that physical harm could result from the dietary modifications, but then they almost dismissed their own raising of that issue. by saying the Select Committee finds that no physical or mental harm could result from the dietary guidelines recommended for the general public. No physical or mental harm could result. Are you quite sure? Are you really, really, really sure? Thank you very much for listening.